In the early 20th century, few believed that humans were under the scrutiny of more advanced yet mortal beings. People went about their daily routines unaware they were being observed, much like they study microbes. From the depths of space, advanced, cold, and ruthless minds devised plans to conquer Earth. The young couple, John and Amy, along with their friend Astra and Oji, spent their time observing Mars. The scientist pointed out a peculiar column of smoke he couldn't explain and showed them a photo, suggesting a possible volcanic eruption on Mars. Despite John and Amy being societal outcasts, due to their love, Astra treated them kindly, much to Amy's delight. The next morning, George went to work at a publishing house, where everyone was discussing the news of several fishing boats allegedly sunk by Russian ships heading towards Japan. George was sent to the Admiralty, where his brother worked in hopes of gathering fresh information for an article. While Amy selects wallpaper for the nursery, the shopkeeper, upon learning who she is, still agrees to make the delivery. Amy takes this as a positive sign. Meanwhile, at the Admiralty, George listens to the British War Minister's rant about the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race before meeting his hostile brother. George invites Frederick over, but he leaves without saying goodbye. Later, George suggests to his wife that she should go to Kolno, acknowledging her intelligence, and confesses that his brother still disapproves of their actions. He regrets involving her in this adventure, but Amy reminds him that she chose it herself. As long as they are together, they can overcome anything. At that moment, a distant rumble is heard outside. Frightened people run into the street and see strange clouds. Oji discovers a fallen meteorite. In the morning, the trio visits the site, finding a huge round object in the middle of the forest. George suggests it might be a giant projectile, but wonders what kind of cannon could have fired it. Amy proposes sending a message to the newspaper, but the telegraphs aren't working. She insists George take a photo and deliver it to the newspaper himself, believing the material will surely be published. He leaves and Amy and Oji begin examining the object. George tells his editor about the incident, but the editor refuses to print it. His brother has explicitly forbidden giving him work. Amy explains to Oji that George, at his family's insistence, married his cousin, a relationship that made both miserable. When Amy and George met, they fell in love and began living together, although they can't formalize their relationship. Suddenly, the sphere cracks. Oji doesn't have time to examine it further as the royal astronomer arrives, photographing the scene. George visits his ex-wife to ask her to sign divorce papers, but she resolutely refuses. Meanwhile, the excavation continues, and the meteorite starts to move and tick. Excited people gather as George arrives. The astronomer approaches the object, which sheds its shell. The sphere rises into the air, and the astronomer bursts into flames. Despite efforts to extinguish him, it's futile. Panic ensues, and the crowd disperses. George grabs Amy as the sphere disintegrates into tiny pieces. They return to the panicking town as another meteorite falls nearby. In the morning, George goes to the wasteland to find Oji, but the area is cordoned off by the military, who claim there was just a fire. Amy looks for Oji at his house, but finds only photographs of strange objects. A crater begins to form at the second meteorite's impact site. George's brother learns that George didn't go to work and is somewhere near the incident. Terrifying events unfold in the town as something approaches, destroying everything and killing people. George catches a horse, seats Amy on it, and tries to leave the town when a giant Martian tripod rises over a building, making eerie sounds. George orders Amy to ride to London to find his brother while he stays on the rubble-strewn street. He doesn't know that similar events are happening in the south of the country, where dozens of bodies float down the river. The government is in panic, telegraphs are not working, and no one knows what's happening in the world. Amy finds Frederick, but he knows nothing about George's fate. Whit this time is escaping from under the debris and heading out of town. Amy tells her brother-in-law about her experiences, and he accuses her of leaving George in danger. She then confesses that she is expecting a child. The action shifts to the future, where Amy, with her now-grown son, wanders the devastated country in search of her husband. Over the ruined cities, desiccating winds blow and lightning flashes. Amy receives a small portion of food from a seller who encourages her to hope for the best. She buys her son a book about the great victory over the Martians. Meanwhile, George escapes from the rubble and goes to his house. After writing a note for Amy, he ponders his next steps and hears sounds in the garden. He meets a young soldier who survived from an entire regiment. They decide to go to London, but along the way they hear a child's cry. George intends to find the child, but they see a huge tripod. The men hide and the child falls silent. At this time, George's brother brings Amy to the minister, where she shows photos of Mars. The men are skeptical, as the speed of arrival is staggering, but the events speak for themselves. George and the soldier find a surgeon gathering volunteers. Many soldiers have already died, and the surgeon hopes to shoot the not-yet-open sphere with cannons. George refuses to join the army, needing to find Amy, but the surgeon holds him at gunpoint, forcing him to become a soldier. In the future, Amy's son reads a book about the victory over the Martians and asks about his father's fate. Amy assures him that his father was very brave and also fought against the invaders in the past. The surgeon's small squad finds the sphere in the forest and prepares their gun. George tries to stop them, but it's useless. Determined, the surgeon orders the soldiers to fire. The sphere rises into the air and then disintegrates into thousands of tiny pieces. People celebrate the victory and go to inspect the crash site, but a Martian tripod suddenly rises above them. In London, the minister tries to convince the crowd that the British troops are the bravest and their guns the best. The alien fires on the military detachment, and George, fleeing, sees many Martian tripods behind him, realizing they are already numerous on Earth. Amy sits on the steps of the Admiralty when a Martian tripod appears from behind the building. People run as it sprays them with deadly black smoke. Frederick, Amy, and the minister run into an alley, barely managing to close the doors. The politician, excited and dreaming of capturing the alien weapon to conquer the world, suddenly feels ill. He was the last to run and inhaled the smoke. Black liquid begins to flow from his mouth, and Amy and Frederick escape. Meanwhile, George reaches the outskirts of London, where refugees tell him that most are headed to the coast. Frederick and Amy head there too. In the future, Amy learns there is a man from her town on the church list and waits for his arrival with hope. In the past, George reaches the beach filled with refugees. Amy searches for her husband among the people, while Frederick tries to organize the evacuation. He orders Amy get into a boat, though she doesn't want to leave. Then George finds his brother. He calls out to Amy, and hearing his voice, she jumps out of the boat, which the Martian immediately sinks. Amy saves a girl and swims toward her husband. People see a shot from a ship sever the Martian's leg, and it dies. People on the shore rejoice. George and Amy get ashore with the rescued girl and Frederick, and they start running as another alien falls behind them. All this Amy remembers while waiting for the arrival of her fellow townsman, who turns out to be OG. He tells her he was very ill for a long time and then conducted experiments on captured weapons. She tells him that she lost George a long time ago and hasn't seen him since. OG is skeptical about humanity's victory. After all, the aliens achieved their goal. They scouted the paths, landed, and seeded Earth with red weeds that kill all living things. The events return to the day the refugees reach the outskirts. George and Amy share their experiences when the sound of a tripod is heard outside. Everyone hides under the table as the Martian falls near the house. People go to see what happened. In a bleak future, people try to sow grain, but the red plants stifle it. Preachers call for prayer, and OG continues to study the Martian legacy. The scientist tells them he survived by jumping into the river and then hiding in the sewer for a long time. When he came to his senses, the victory had already been won. Amy remembers how they hid in that house and dawn never came. People realized it was the smoke hiding the earth from the light. George feels unwell, so Frederick and Amy go looking for food and water. Together, they inspect the house and find human bodies in the inner courtyard, apparently dumped there by the Martians. Returning to the common room, they hear the sounds of tripods and hide under the tables. Everyone except an exhausted elderly lady. In the future, little George falls ill, and OG promises to come up with something. He constantly observes Mars, waiting for opposition, and Amy asks questions about God. In the past, Frederick recalls Britain's past victories, suggesting they make homemade grenades from lamp oil. He is full of enthusiasm, which George extinguishes, arguing that Britain has been doing the same thing to other nations for many years. What if this is punishment? Frederick disagrees with George's beliefs and yells at him. When George feels unwell, Amy calls for them to leave the house. In the future, little George gets worse. Amy asks the scientist to grow typhoid cells to make a vaccine, puzzling OG. In the past, the trio goes into the courtyard where a Martian roams. It seems ill or injured. They hope to leave unnoticed, but another monster penetrates inside and grabs the girl. Nevertheless, the others manage to run into the courtyard. Frederick throws a homemade grenade at the Martian. It catches fire, but in its last effort, it attacks the man. Amy and George hide in the basement where George's condition worsens. Amy then realizes that the Martians crawled out of the machines to eat people, which killed them. In the future, she suggests OG vaccinate the survivors, but the priest objects, so the scientist does everything in secret. He collects materials from the bodies of the dead and prepares a typhoid vaccine. Amy remembers how, after everything that happened, George lost his mind. He dreams of negotiating with the Martians, believing that Amy despises him. She asks him to wait until the Martian in the courtyard dies, and then they can leave. In the future, OG wakes Amy. He has managed to make a vaccine, but more importantly, this vaccine kills the red mold. They can clear the land and sow seeds. Little George feels better, but the priest doesn't believe in this ungodly doctrine. He argues that it cannot be that some bacteria killed the invaders. Budgie reminds him that earthly organisms adapted to earthly diseases, paying for it with millions of lives. In the past, Amy feels unwell, and George again brings up the idea of negotiating with the Martians. His wife tries to reason with him, but he goes into the yard. Amy runs after him and sees a Martian appear from around the corner. George distracts the Martian, giving Amy a chance to run, and dies. Now Amy remembers that she left him and therefore survived. OG convinces her that she did everything right, for she was saving the child. But Amy doesn't understand what good can await little George in the future. The scientist proves that life is valuable. Amy then reached their former home and found the note George left for her. Her son asks his mother to tell him about the planet. Amy begins to tell him about distant India, where she grew up, about the sun, blue sky, mountains, and animals. She sailed here, and although it was always rainy, she loved this land where there were many children. George asks his mother to go where all this remains. Amy promises that it will all be, and heads to the land she and OG decontaminated, where the first shoots appear and the clouds disperse, revealing the first rays of the sun. The show ends here. Make sure to subscribe for more recaps like this.